What I'm seeking to do in this paper is to provide a brief, but I hope comprehensive, history of Jersey's occupation economy. Now, it's sometimes said if you steal from one person, it's called plagiarism. If you steal from several, it's called research. This paper is research, and I'm going to acknowledge in particular three publications I've drawn on very heavily. The books by Paul Sanders and Charles Cruikshank, both sort of official histories, and also Andrew Gilson's epic study on the German occupation of Jersey, particularly with respect to agriculture. So to understand the occupation economy, first of all, we need to know what the economy was like pre-war. A quick review of Jersey's economic history is probably helpful here. Jersey has always been an outward-looking economy, heavily dependent on international trade and the two-way flow of people. As you know, we had a massive boom in the first half of the 19th century, largely because of the cod fishing industry. The population doubled between 1821 and 1851. We then had a period of relative decline and falling population as the maritime industry collapsed. The population fell by 8% from its 1851 peak, and then it fell further to probably 18% on a comparative basis by 1921. And the population in 1921 was considerably below that of 1851. During the interwar period, we had gradual recovery, and the population had increased by 1939 to 51,080, which was still significantly below where it had been in 1851. We don't have detailed statistics on the pre-war economy as we do today. We have a 1931 census, which showed that 19% of the population were employed in agriculture, 15% were in personal service, 12% in commerce and finance, and 30% were in other. That is not very helpful to those trying to understand the economy. But we can usefully divide the pre-war economy into two completely different bits. The first was the domestic economy, people working to produce goods and services that were going to be for consumption within the island by local people. And secondly, we had the export economy. This was the production of what might be called luxury crops for export. So agriculture was mainly geared to export, not to serving the local community. And this meant that the island had to import food and many other commodities that it needed that could not viably be produced on island. These were paid for by exports. It's estimated that agricultural exports accounted for 50% of export revenue. The island also had a modest finance industry. There was money coming into the island from personal investments and pensions held by rich people, some of whom had come to settle in the island because of the favourable tax treatment. Jersey also had a significant tourist trade. Tourists contribute to the local economy by buying goods and services, and this feeds through to incomes, employment, and tax revenue. Now, although Jersey then, as now, was geographically much closer to France than to England, the economy was integrated into the British economy and not the French economy. So what about the immediate consequences of the occupation? Given that Jersey's economy was integrated into the UK economy, the occupation was very clearly a huge shock to the system. Now, the occupation should not have come as a great surprise, given that by May 1940, the island was largely surrounded by German forces, and there was no strategic purpose in the British attempting to defend the islands. However, no preparation seemed to have been made for potential occupation. Indeed, in the spring of 1940, Jersey was advertising for tourists to visit the island. And some tourists had a much longer stay than they had expected, as they were trapped when the occupation began. Now, as you all know, on the 19th of June, Jersey was demilitarized. The 1st of July, the German troops arrived. 2nd of July, they took over the administration. The occupation began and all communication with the United Kingdom ceased. And that's not all. Prior to the occupation, 6,500 people had chosen to leave the island. And before then, many young men had signed up to the armed forces. The German authorities were an occupying power. Now, there are rules governing the behavior of occupying powers known as the Hague Convention. I thought that this applied in Jersey, but reading Cruikshank again last night, technically it didn't. However, the German authorities seemed to behave as if the Hague Convention did apply. So, for example, they could not force local people to work in support of military objectives, although the dividing line between what is and is not a military objective can be quite blurred. The occupying power had legal responsibility for the well-being of the people of Jersey. And generally, and one stresses generally, the occupying power did comply with the provisions of the Hague Convention. The whole administration of the island was left to the Jersey authorities, but with laws having to be approved by the German authorities, not the Privy Council. Now, in Jersey, constitutional reform is always on the agenda and can be a long, drawn-out affair. But there's nothing like an invasion to make things happen quite quickly. The States Assembly continued to meet, but established a superior council charged with exercising most of the powers of the Assembly. 8 large departments were created, each under the presidency of a member of the Assembly, all but one of whom happened to be jurists. So together they were the Superior Council, together with the Crown officers and the bailiff Alexander Coutanche. The council met roughly weekly throughout the war and in practice was the government of the island. The bailiff, who had also been appointed lieutenant governor, chaired the council and was for all practical purposes the chief minister of the island. Now, the banking system is an inherent part of any economy. Now, prior to the occupation, the banks had actually realized there might be an occupation, and they arranged for as much as possible to be shipped out of the island. So bearer securities, documents, and anything. They did ask the British government to lend a destroyer to move these documents to Britain, and I think the British government said they had better uses for destroyers than moving documents from Jersey. Local people were encouraged to move their bank accounts to the UK. Now, the British government had given some thought to what would happen in the event of occupation, and they agreed that the bank should continue working more or less as normal. So you could go to Barclays Bank and continue your banking, but clearly with a rather reduced level of service. Transactions were cleared within the island. The banks denominated accounts in sterling, but the German authorities introduced the Reichsmarks at a rate originally of 5 to the pound sterling, grossly overvalued, finished up at 9.36, modestly overvalued. And that gave great scope to arbitrage of people doing things in different currencies. Retailers had a bit of a problem. They quoted prices in sterling while payments were made in Reichsmarks. So they needed a calculator, but I don't think they existed then, in order to work out how much change to give. So quickly, 4 key elements of the occupation I want to run through: importing food and essential commodities that couldn't be produced on island, restructuring agriculture, how the people adapted to the new situation, and finally, the public finances. So supplying the island. As I said earlier, Jersey, before the occupation, imported vast amounts from the UK. Now, partly this loss of supply was compensated for by domestic reforms, which I'll come on to, but imports were essential, and they weren't going to come from England. A purchasing commission was set up with Jersey, Guernsey, and the occupying power, and Jean Jouot was the Jersey representative. Their task was to go to France and to buy things. Now, that was easier said than done for several reasons. First of all, they weren't the only people trying to buy things in France. They were competing with others who wanted to buy the same things. Secondly, there's no point in buying stuff in France if you can't get it to Jersey. so they had to arrange for the transport, and finally they had no money. Having said that, they did a pretty good job. They bluffed their way through France, buying stuff and promising to pay eventually. They borrowed from the banks, and by a very complex arrangement, which is in Saunders' book, which I couldn't understand, somehow the French finished up paying for some of the Jersey goods, which was a good thing. On to agriculture. And here I'm going to draw heavily on Andrew Gilson and recognise his great work, not least because he's here today. Now, it was very quickly recognised that drastic changes were needed in the agricultural industry. First problem, the tomatoes had been grown but not harvested. What do you do with loads of tomatoes when you don't have a market? Also, Jersey had relied on imports from the UK for fertilisers, for seeds, and a lot of other stuff that agriculture needed. Another problem, the occupying power had the power to requisition food, and it required the Jersey farmers to provide them with food. Another problem, the Germans needed labour, and they could employ local people, and they did. And they could pay an awful lot more than farmers, like twice as much, and in some cases 5 times as much. So the agricultural industry had some problems, lost its export market, lost its imports, and couldn't employ staff. Not a great start. But it was accepted that there had to be central control. And indeed, we had a command economy. The government stipulated wages that could be paid, prices that could be charged, animals that could be reared or slaughtered, crops that had to be grown, and they stipulated the amounts that were needed. The Department of Agriculture became, in effect, a monopoly buyer of everything. Now, in fact, the way the island was transformed was little short of remarkable. The growing of cereals had been substantially reduced before the war, and replaced by potatoes. That needed to change. By the end of the occupation, almost half the land was used for cereal production. 5 watermills, Gargate, Tessor, Grandval, Molasses and Ketterville, were brought into use. They hadn't been used for many years. And millers, who hadn't been used for many years either, were brought out of retirement from their golf courses or bowls to operate the mills. Horses made a comeback, largely as a substitute for tractors. And there was significant innovation in respect of fertilizers, pesticides, and storing of food. Potato growing continued at a reduced rate, but with much of the product being requisitioned by the occupying power and some sold in France. There were novel techniques for storing potatoes, including digging holes in the ground, lining them, I think, with straw. Fascinating way, but potatoes were preserved like that. Tobacco became an important crop, and you can hear Andrew next week speak about how it was used as a currency. By 1943, apparently almost every farmer and smallholder grew some tobacco. It was not only a cash crop, it was also used for barter and as a de facto currency. And indeed, cigarettes were a currency in the internment camps and in prisoner of war camps. Andrew has published a table showing tobacco processed by a local firm, J.F. Germain and Sons. The volume was £590 in 1940, £48,000 in 1944. Now, farmers are fiercely independent, in particular Jersey farmers, and they didn't like being told what to do, and there were tensions. So Andrew lists all the many transgressions that were reported to the authorities and the action taken, which ranged from friendly warnings to action in the courts. And the parish constables played a major role here. Andrew credits 2 people with being responsible for the agriculture industry operating as it did. There was Tuzel Brie, head of the Department of Agriculture in Jersey, and Hans Egon Peltz, the German head of agriculture and food supply for the Channel Islands. They worked together as they had to work together and produced some pretty good results for the island. When Peltz was transferred in 1944, the situation got worse, and as you all know, in the final year of occupation, things were pretty grim. So the nature of the occupation did change drastically from March 1944, when it was clear that there would be an Allied invasion. The decision was taken by the German authorities to turn the Channel Islands into a fortress, and there was a wider change in the composition of the German people in the island. From the summer of 1944, contact with France ceased, and Jersey and the occupying forces were on their own. Agricultural output fell, the occupying power requisitioned more of what was available, rationing became more severe, black market prices increased. The production and distribution of milk and butter was the cause of particular tension between the German authorities and the island. But despite the many controls that were in place, many Jersey farmers were able to circumvent them. Undeclared produce was distributed to friends and family, as well as being supplied onto the black market. So how did the economy adapt? An immediate consequence of the arrival of German troops was their impact on local retailers. Barry Turner, in his book Outpost of Occupation, describes how the German troops saw stuff in the stores they'd never seen before and bought it. This didn't go down too well, even with the German authorities, and there were limits placed on what they were able to purchase. In the early days, there was a plentiful supply of fish, but then that stopped quite quickly. The beaches were mined, the occupying power intercepted the catch, and increasingly access to the coast was banned. Rationing was introduced early in 1941 and continued until well after the end of the occupation. Bread, milk, butter, sugar, tea, and meat were among the commodities that were rationed. Most vegetables were not rationed, but of course they were seasonal and often in short supply. The transformation of agriculture helped to feed islanders throughout the occupation, but was not sufficient. People had to improvise, and they did, and much of that improvisation sadly was eating less. Those who were able to grew what food they could, and that meant that those living in the country areas were far better placed than those in the town. Rabbit keeping became widespread, not because rabbits were nice furry things to keep as pets, but as food. Locally available produce was substituted for conventional food. Now, the various accounts of the occupation, I'm sure you've read them, including my mother's, I hope, record the various ways that people improvised. Coffee was made from parsnips, sugar beet, barley, and acorns, particularly in St. Juan's, I gather. No, that's not true. Pudding was made from seaweed. That was definitely in St. Juan's. Potato peel cake, flour made from potatoes, and fish cakes made from limpets. Now, while the substitutes were better than nothing, they weren't great, and people had to do with not a lot of food and inadequate food. The substitution applied to many other goods. Toothpaste and soap were made from chemical substitutes. Shoes had wooden soles, and bicycle tires were made from hose pipes. Goods that were no longer usable were cannibalized, so the soles of one shoe were added to the uppers from another. A lively second-hand market developed. Some retailers became exchange centres, while individuals offered what they could and wanted in exchange. Today, people talk about recycling and the circular economy, although in reality we live in a disposable economy. In the occupation, recycling and barter was not done to save the planet, but was a necessity. Transport was radically affected by the occupation. Fuel supplies were cut off immediately, and what fuel there was requisitioned by the Germans. Jersey went overnight from a society making extensive use of motor cars to a car-free society. Perhaps we might try again today to save the planet. Horse-drawn vehicles reappeared, and bicycles became a standard method of travel, even with hosepipes for tyres. So on to a fairly controversial issue of the black market. A black market existed throughout the occupation, as it did in all occupied areas and in many countries, UK included, that were not occupied. It's helpful to understand the nature of black markets. As with a name like black, instinctively it sounds like a bad thing. They're not a bad thing. Yes, there are abuses, as there are in formal markets. Black markets generally perform a useful function. So a black market exists where the price of a good or service is at a different level from the market price. That is the price at which willing buyers and sellers want to trade. They exist today. The demand for tickets for concerts by star artists or major sporting events far exceeds the supply at the official price. Many people are willing to pay more than the official price. People who have tickets are willing to exchange them for more than the price they paid. Both parties are satisfied. That's a bit of an oversimplification, because many of the sellers in the black market have no wish to attend the event at all. They've been able to acquire tickets by devious means and to make a profit. They therefore deprive genuine customers of the opportunity to buy at the official price. For this reason, attempts are made to stop tickets falling into the hands of touts. Those attempts are unblemished by any success. Such is the power of the market. Informal markets also exist where the official price of a good or service is above the market price. The taxi market in Jersey is a good example. Are there any taxi drivers here? Good. A number of regulatory measures in Jersey, by accident or design, have reduced the supply of official taxis and reduced the cost. Regulation does not permit a second-hand Ford Fiesta taxi service. But there is a demand for a second-hand Ford Fiesta taxi service at a price appropriate to second-hand Ford Fiestas. Jersey Lifts provides that service. It's a black market, absolutely classic. But so much for the theory. What happened in Jersey? It was inevitable that there would be a black market. Wherever there is rationing, wherever there is price control, there will be a black market. Now, there are three different types of black market, two of which existed in Jersey during the occupation. The first was that goods were smuggled in to the island. So while there were connections with France, the boats plying to and from France would bring in extra supplies, not quite sure where they got them from, and supply them into the black market in Jersey. They increased the supply of goods in relation to the demand, and therefore they reduced the price. Second type of black market is the unofficial supplies of milk, meat and vegetables from farmers. Farmers were directed what to produce and had to sell at the official price to the government. But some farmers could produce more, and some were a bit devious in how they went about things. And with what they produced over and above what they had to provide, they consumed it, helped their family, friends, and sold into the black market. Some people in rural areas who were not farmers did what they could also to supply the black market. Now, again, this has a beneficial effect. It increases the supply in relation to the demand. But there's a third type of black market. That is where official supplies are expropriated and sold at way above the market price. This is inherently a bad black market, and it results in people paying more than they would have to pay. People generally in official positions enrich themselves. Such markets are common and almost certainly are in operation in various war zones in the world today. They're most likely to occur in jurisdictions with inbuilt corruption. Jersey did not have inbuilt corruption, and there's little evidence of this type of black market in the occupation. But Jersey did have the first and second types of black market, the stuff coming in from France and stuff produced locally. Now, it would be great to give you figures on the size of the black market, but sadly, people supplying the black market are not obliged to produce statistics. And if they did, they would not be very reliable. But we know that as the occupation went on, black market prices increased, and particularly after D-Day, when supply from France fell. Sanders has given some figures for Guernsey, which are probably similar to those for Jersey. Prior to the occupation, butter was 20 pence a pound. The official price during the occupation nearly doubled to 36 pence. In 1943-44, the black market price was £1 and 5 shillings, and in 1944-45, it was £3 and 10 shillings, a 30-fold increase in the price of butter. Charles Cruikshank, Andrew Gilson's view is that the black market was small and largely family-based, and he attributed this to vigilant inspection by the authorities, which made large-scale black market activity difficult to conceal. But also Jersey farmers could sell directly to the German authorities, often at an enhanced price. So why take the risks of the black market when you can actually supply officially to the German authorities? Now, Charles Cruikshank, in a more wide-ranging study, and that means less detailed on the specifics, took a rather different view. He said the main black market was run by greedy and unscrupulous islanders for their own profit and the benefit of other greedy and unscrupulous islanders, at the expense of those who were prepared to abide by the rationing rules. He goes on, according to one authority, however, only a few hundred people did not participate in it, either because they couldn't afford black market prices or because they were too old or infirm to fetch the goods. If this is true, the discriminatory effect of the black market may have been less. Now, a black market in which almost everybody participates is not really a black market. Price fixing is difficult, particularly for agricultural goods, and a black market compensates for the inefficiency of a formal market. Now, although Cruikshank refers to greedy and unscrupulous islanders, an equally valid interpretation is that those supplying the black market provided an essential source of supply that would not otherwise have existed and which therefore kept prices down. Saunders similarly suggested that the black market was almost universal. So perhaps the expression parallel or informal market would be more appropriate. Finally, public finances. Now, there's scope for a very detailed analysis of government finances during the occupation, and you'll be relieved to know that this is not it. Now, the occupation posed an existential threat to the public finances. Jersey had to meet most of the costs of the occupation, i.e. paying money to the German authorities, but tax revenue plummeted. In August 1939, government revenue was £28,000. In August 1940, it was £9,000. The initial response was to increase tax. So prior to the occupation, income tax was at 1.6%. This was increased to 3.75% and then to 20%, with an additional 10% on salaries. The tax on wines and spirits was more than doubled. The tobacco tax was tripled. Beer tax increased 2.5 times. 80% tax on casual transactions, 60% on property, and 100% on currency transactions. How effective they were is not certain, but as a general rule, the higher the tax rate, the greater the effect on activity and the incentive to avoid the tax. 100% tax rates are 100% ineffective at raising any revenue for that reason. The tax increases were not nearly sufficient to meet expenditure. Total government revenue fell from 512,000 pre-war to 360,000 in 1940 and 280,000 in 1941. The state's accounts for the year ended 31 January 1945 show revenue of 322,000 and expenditure of 858,000. The projections for the following year were no better. Revenue lower at 233,000, expenditure at 733,000. Government expenditure included, as I've said, meeting some of the costs of occupation, and also the government subsidised some commodities, in particular flour, in order to keep down the price of bread. So, at the end of the occupation, the government had a debt. It owed around £6 million to the banks and another 200,000 to other creditors. And rehabilitation costs were estimated at about £1.5 million. So in round terms, a debt of 7.6 million. Doesn't sound a lot, but that was in 1945 prices. And in today's prices, say 250 million or a quarter of a hospital. But this grossly understates the true position. A more meaningful comparison is that the debt was about 12 times annual government revenue, or 12 hospitals. So how do we deal with the debt? Now, although the occupation was pretty unexpected, liberation was not. and quite extensive preparations were made in mid-1944 in the expectation that liberation would occur shortly. Well, as we know, it did not. So in April 1944, the clearing banks got together and produced a paper on some of the issues that would need to be dealt with. And immediately after the war, there were discussions between the government in the form of the Home Office, the banks, and the Channel Islands. The government immediately agreed that local people could convert their Reichsmarks to sterling, which was helpful. But the big discussion was on what to do with the debt. The British government realised that that sort of debt could not be repaid. And eventually a package was agreed. The British government granted 4.2 million specifically to reduce the debt to the banks. And this was justified on the grounds that the islands had to meet the cost of the occupation, which should be regarded as an imperial war debt. The banks, always wanting their money back, wrote off some of the debts, effectively transformed the rest into bonds paying 2%, and agreed to buy from the government bonds at 3% to finance rehabilitation. But the British government grant did not come without strings. Now, Jersey's constitution pre-war was not quite democratic. Jurates elected for life sat in the Royal Court and the States Assembly and also occupied most of the major positions. The rectors of the 12 parishes were members of the Assembly. There were strong pressures for reform after the war. Those pressures came from people who'd served in the armed forces, people who'd worked on the war effort in London, from local people, from people who'd been interned in Germany. But there was also pressure from the British government. So I found an official minute of a meeting held in November 1945. Mr. Chuter Eade, funny name, but he was the Home Secretary, stated that many of his colleagues were exercised as to the present constitution of the island parliament, and that he could not promise anything in the way of settlement to the island debt until he was aware of the constitutional reforms of the newly elected members to be put into operation. He suggested that whilst the form of change in the island government was not for them to decide, that the British government would be very concerned if these suggested changes did not indicate definite moves towards a more democratic form of representation in the States Assembly. If I can translate that, no reform, no money. So let me pull all this together with some conclusions. The occupation was not a pleasant experience, but neither was being a civilian in many countries during the war. In terms of food, certainly the people of Jersey were pretty badly off compared with the UK in the final year, but not worse off than many in Europe who were losing their homes and in many cases their lives. I don't think economic well-being was foremost in the minds of most people. They were more concerned about family and friends fighting in the war or evacuated to the UK or interned in Germany. But the Superior Council had responsibility for managing the economy in a way that best served islanders, and it had to do it under military occupation with the occupying power having the final say. Now, generally, the view is that the occupation was handled rather well by the island authorities. The transformation of the agriculture was a particular success. The Purchasing Commission did a pretty good job. Rationing was as good as it could be. The black market was not exploitative. The people of Jersey played their part by accepting reality and operating the circular economy and recycling before it became fashionable. What is interesting is that after the occupation, the economy made a remarkable transformation. Very rapid success, dynamic economy, rapid growth, well documented in a paper by David Wilson, which deserves rather more publicity than it's had. And I think there's a view that the wartime experience enabled that to happen. It changed attitudes. It opened people's eyes and minds to different ways of doing things. So I hope that's a quick canter through the wartime economy. Not a pleasant experience, but something that people in Jersey, I think, need to understand. And I'm sure the economic experience during the war, as well as all the other experiences, played a significant part in the changes that were needed after the war. Thank you.